It is September 16th, 2012, and this is Marianne Johnson, and I'm talking to Chris Riddiough here at the CAWHC headquarters. So Chris, let's start, and would you please give us your full name and your date of birth?
Okay, it's Christine Ruth Riddiough, June 28th, 1946.
You were born 2 years after I was.
Oh.
Okay, so, well, Chris, tell me a little bit about your background. Where were you born, and what were some of the major influences on you as a young person?
Oh, okay. Well, I was born in Chicago, but we moved up to Milwaukee when I was 6 months old, so I grew up in Milwaukee area, Milwaukee and Wauwatosa, and gee, what were the influences? Well,
tell me about your family. What sort of family you had.
Okay. Well, my mother, on my mother's side of the family, everybody was relatively old when they got married and had kids. So I was the oldest, and my mother was 34 when I was born. And her family, we were most tied into. Her parents came over from Sweden around 1900, and so there was a whole big Swedish thing that went on. Every Christmas, Swedish meatballs and the whole rigmarole. And then my father was considerably older. He was born in 1892, and his family came over from England. And he basically did not talk to his family most of the time, so we had very little to do with them. I have cousins that I've met once, over the last 60 plus years. Mm-hmm. And then I have a younger sister, Constance, who's a year younger than me. Mm-hmm. And my parents were basically sort of liberals. I mean, they were for Adlai Stevenson in the 50s. I learned after my father died, he died in 63, that he had in his youth been a member of the Socialist Party and had run for county clerk in Ogden, Utah, on the same ticket as Eugene V. Debs in 1920. Yes. And he never talked about it, and he and my mother were very sort of concerned about what would happen to him, because in the 50s he worked for the federal government as a lawyer, and Joe McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin and not particularly keen on any left-leaning people in government. So they were very nervous about this, and I didn't know exactly why, but I got, I knew that there was something going on there. Now, one of my first memories is we got a TV when I was about 6, so right around 1952, and I remember watching the political conventions on TV, on this little black and white TV, and finding it very exciting. Mm-hmm. And then in 56, I was in 5th grade, and we had a little mock election in my 5th grade class. Now, we were now in Wauwatosa, which was a very conservative suburb of Milwaukee, big John Birch stronghold. And we had 34 students in the class, and 2 of us voted for Adlai Stevenson. And I was really mad because the other Stevenson supporter never said who it was. So I never knew who the other Stevenson person was.
But you knew there was one other.
Yes, one other, yes. It was 32-2 for Eisenhower. And then in 60, I was 14. I was like totally gung-ho for Kennedy. My mother said, you don't want to just be knee-jerk about this, and said you have to read up on the candidates. So that was my parents were both big readers, so, reading up and finding information was very important. And so all of that stuff sort of got me interested in politics. My parents were fairly interested in politics, and then I went off to, I graduated high school in 64, which was the year that George Wallace won the Wisconsin primary. And I wrote a letter to the Wauwatosa News-Times saying I thought this was a travesty. And my history teacher in high school berated me for being so anti-Wauwatosa And it was kind of shocking to me because here I was being sort of civic-minded and writing in my opinion, and I get knocked about. And my best friend back then wrote a letter in support of me, which was really nice because she was not very political. But then I went off to college and I got involved in the anti-Vietnam demonstrations.
Where did you go to college?
Carleton College in Northville, Minnesota.
Okay.
And I was an astronomy major, and Carleton didn't have minors per se, but I basically minored in physics and political science. Mm-hmm. And
let's go back to the childhood just a bit. Mm-hmm. When you were in elementary school, did you go to public schools then? Uh-huh.
Yeah, when we lived in Milwaukee up until I was 9, I went to what was then the 21st Street School and is now the Phyllis Wheatley School. That was sort of inner city, although at that point it was fairly mixed ethnically. Now it's an area that's, and has been for decades, it's predominantly African American. And then we moved out to Wauwatosa, and I went to the public school there, Lincoln School, and I went through public schools. Graduated from Wauwatosa East High School. Mm-hmm. So, it was all public school. I went to Carleton, which was a private school, mm-hmm. And basically got a combination of loans and scholarships to put me through college and work study. At that point, the total fee for going to Carleton, room, board, and tuition, was about $2,500 a year. Mm-hmm. And so that was pretty much all covered, because at that point, my father had died. My mother hadn't worked outside the home when we were kids, and so she had his pension and then eventually got a job as a sort of administrative person at the local newspaper. Mm-hmm. But she really didn't have any money to send us.
And your father had worked in government?
Yes, he had quit school when he was 13 in 1905, went to work on the railroads, and eventually went back to college and got a law degree when he was in his 30s, and then got a job as an immigration lawyer for the government. Mm-hmm. And so he had had a government pension, and he retired about 6 months before he died, and luckily for my mother, he took a pension plan that meant that she got his pension for the rest of her life, because otherwise we would have been screwed. Mm-hmm. So as an aside, one of the things that these days I find especially irritating is Paul Ryan talking about how his father died when he was in high school, and he got these scholarships to put him through college, and now he doesn't want anybody else to be able to do the same thing. It's just very selfish, I think.
Yeah. So how did you happen to go to Carleton?
Well, my best friend from high school, actually, we've known each other now since 1955, and we still see each other. She lives out near D.C. too. Her parents had gone to Carleton back in the pre-war years, and so she was going to apply for Carleton, and so I thought, well, I'll apply to Carleton. And I applied also to Northwestern because my uncle had gone to Northwestern. And I was going to apply to Radcliffe because this friend's sister was in physics at Radcliffe. And I went to a Radcliffe tea, and I decided I was not the white glove Radcliffe type, so I never applied there. No. And when I got into Northwestern in Carleton. When I went to Northwestern, they asked me what sorority I wanted to join. So I decided that was not the place. So I went to Carleton, and this friend went to Ripon. So,
okay.
But she also got me started thinking consciously about feminism, sort of inadvertently, because when I was 17 for my birthday, she gave me The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. Mm-hmm. And this summer we were talking about it, and she said she'd given it to me because she didn't like it and wanted to know what I thought. And I thought, geez, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, And so that got me thinking about, that there is something else out there.
And was this this must have been after you went to college?
Well, this was 63, so I was in high school
Oh, you were,
when I read it,
oh,
yeah.
63, that's
Yeah.
right. Okay, yeah,
So it was right after it was published.
that's right, right.
So,
So what was going on at Carleton when you went there?
well, when I started at Carleton in 64, it was, there wasn't a lot of political activity initially. I mean, I got into the YDFL, which is the Young Democrats, except in Minnesota, it's the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And there was a women's league that was sort of like the women's dormitories. Everybody lived in the dorms at Carleton. It was a small student body. I think at that point it was under 2,000 students altogether. And women had to wear dresses to dinner. If you're going to be out, as I recall, it was like after 7 on a weekday evening, you had to sign out, and girls couldn't be out after 10 on the weekdays and stuff like that. And at some point in my freshman year, people started both protesting about Vietnam and about the rules for women. And I remember they had RAs who were upper class, resident assistants who were upper class women, who were supposed to supervise the floors and stuff. And one of our RAs was a Quaker who started talking about how bad the Vietnam War was. And my initial reaction was, oh, that's un-American, you can't be saying that stuff. And then, following my mother's dictates, I started reading about it, and I decided maybe it wasn't so bad what she was saying, and I started getting involved in protests. And so we then, over the course of the next 3 years, there were local protests, sit-ins when the military recruiters came, and we would go up to the Twin Cities for teach-ins. And in '68, I organized for Eugene McCarthy, and we took a couple of busloads of students over to Green Bay to get out the vote for McCarthy, and so on. So that was the big focus from like 65 to 68 when I graduated, and was, anti-Vietnam. And then the rules for women did change. I mean, they, at some point in there, they stopped having the rules about you had to wear a dress to dinner and you had to sign out and stuff like that. So that started changing. And I remember hearing about NOW getting organized, and I probably sent them in, $10 or $5 or something, whatever, little student amount I could send in. But all of that is fairly vague in my mind right now, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. So after college, what happened?
Well, I applied to graduate school, and I got into Northwestern, and I was a graduate student in astrophysics. And so I came down to Chicago. Actually, the week that I started to look for an apartment was the week of the Democratic Convention, so I went down to the Loop, and I see all of this going on, and it was, having been used to being in a very small town in Minnesota, it was a little overwhelming, I guess you could say.
What did you see when you went down there?
Well, the thing that I remember most vividly was going down Michigan Avenue and seeing just people in the Grant Park area, and then on Michigan Avenue on the sidewalk, all of these police in their baby blue helmets with their billy clubs and stuff, and that was very freaky to see. I mean, so now Northwestern is up in Evanston, so I was up there. I got a place up there to live and went to school and stayed involved in the anti-Vietnam stuff and things like that. And then
you were studying astrophysics?
Astrophysics, yes.
And how did you happen to get into that field?
Well, as I recall, when I was about 9, I don't know whether I read something or we did something in school, but I got totally into space and space travel and stars, and I wanted to be a scientist and all of this stuff. And then when I was 11, Sputnik went up, and that was like, okay, I got to do this. And I mean, at that point, one of the reasons my mother has said she wanted to move out of that neighborhood was that it was fairly German, with traditional German values, Kinder, Kirche, Kuche, and she wanted me and my sister to go to college. And the attitude was, oh, that's so cute, this little girl wants to be a scientist, but she'll learn, girls can't do that. And my mother and my father both were actually very supportive. I don't think they understood why the astronomy thing was, because neither of them were into science, but they were like, okay, if that's what you want to do, go for it. And so I did a lot of science, and I was good in math and science in school. One of the things I do remember from high school was they had us all talk to our guidance counselors about college, and the guidance counselor I went to said, why don't you think about River Falls State College? They have a good home ec program. And I said, basically, the only class I got a D in school was home ec. Why are you telling me this? So it was a little frustrating. But, I still maintain an interest in this stuff, although in the course of getting into all of this politics stuff, I drifted away from it.
So you were at Northwestern and working, and what was happening at Northwestern when you were there?
Well, I remember calling Northwestern the country club on the North Shore because not much was happening, but there was some anti-war stuff that somehow I got involved in it. I don't really remember how I hooked up with people, except that it was around, and, if you were interested, you would find demonstrations and other activities. And then at some point in there, I think around 69, I met Ellen Du Bois. And Ellen was also a graduate student at Northwestern, although she was in history and was interested in women's history. And she got me involved in a women's group there that met up at Northwestern. There were some people who I think weren't at Northwestern, some who were. There was a house that was like a commune of sorts, not far from the campus, and we would meet there on a regular basis. And it was mostly sort of consciousness raising. And then Ellen knew Vivian Rothstein and knew about the Women's Union. And the weekend of October 31st, 1969, there was a big demonstration in Washington, D.C. against Vietnam, and there was a Palatine conference founding the Women's Liberation Union. And I had to choose which to go to, and I went to the anti-Vietnam one. But when I came back, Ellen basically said, you really should get involved in this women's union, and I did.
And what did you hear about that conference? That was in
Palatine, yeah, Illinois, yeah. I don't remember much detail about it, except that it was this big radical women's organizing effort. And they were going to build this radical women's organization in Chicago. The premise of it appealed because I was now pretty left-wing, and I actually, as somewhat of an aside, somewhere in there, I wrote a paper where I just remember at the very end, I talked about American imperialism and capitalist exploitation and patriarchal oppression, and we had to fight against this. And I showed it to my mother, who then decided to read it to my aunt at Christmas. And my aunt and uncle were quite conservative at that point. And my aunt said to my mother, and to me, Christine, if you really believe that, I don't want you in my house. And my mother said, Mary, if Christine goes, I go. And that was it. Nobody messed with my mother in the family. At that point, she was like the grande dame of the family. And so, but that was sort of, and it's very cliched, but that was sort of what I was thinking. So the idea of a radical women's liberation group really sort of fit in with where I was at that point. So then, I mean, a lot of this, I must say, is very fuzzy in my mind, the whole chronology. But somehow Ellen got me in touch with Vivian Rothstein, who was organizing the Liberation School for Women, and Vivian invited me to be a part of that. And that sort of then got me into the Women's Union. And that was the main focus of my activity from probably about 1970 to 77.
So you became involved with the Chicago Women's Liberation Union in about 1970.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
It was a little bit after Palatine.
And were you still at Northwestern?
Yes. In 1970, I got my Master's of Science in Astrophysics, and in 72, I was admitted to candidacy for my PhD. And then I didn't have any funding, and I was working on this very esoteric thesis with an advisor in the physics department, which was not my smartest move, rather than the astronomy department. And so I had no idea about, I should try and get funding for my research, blah, blah, blah. So ultimately, by 72, I had dropped out and never got my PhD.
And at that time, we'll come back to the union, but at that time, were there many women in that field?
No. When I applied to graduate school, the three top schools in astrophysics were Berkeley, Princeton, and Caltech. And I think of those three, only Berkeley admitted women to the graduate school. The others were men only. And not that I would have gotten into them particularly, but it did sort of limit the choices. And I got into Northwestern, and it turned out when I got there that there was one other woman in the graduate program, and that was true throughout when I was there. And she had been admitted the year before me, and she was the first woman admitted in Northwestern's graduate program in astronomy. And there was at least one professor, I think only one, but one that I dealt with, who basically would not give women A's because we were there taking the place of some man who was more deserving. There was one woman on the faculty who I liked. I mean, if I had been smart, or at least less naive about things, I probably would have had her or this other professor, Su-Shu Wang, be my advisor, because they were doing other kinds of astrophysics. I really wanted to write my thesis on gravitation and general relativity, which was so arcane that, nobody in the department was dealing with it, and I found this physics guy. But it was, the involvement of women was very minimal, and I think overall the percentage of women in physical science at that point was maybe 6%. And it really didn't change for 20 years, and now it's maybe 15%. Now, the other thing that, what with both Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride dying over the summers made me go back and think a little bit about some of this is, I remember going to this seminar or program at the engineering school, which was physics and engineering were right next to the observatory, and it was all the physical science people up there. So the engineers decided to put on a program on mixed male-female crews on long-range space flights. I thought, wow, this sounds great. I was ready to go, And I get there, and it's these dorky guys. The engineers were the worst, in my opinion. And they started out, and they started talking for 10, 15 minutes. They talked about, well, of course there had to be mixed crews on flights like to Mars because they would take hundreds of days, and what would the men do for sex if there weren't women there? So they had to have women. Now, fortunately, women could also cook and clean, so they would be useful, on the flight. there were some downsides, of course, because they would have to have space to put all of the cotex that they would need for these long-range flights, plus the hair dryers. And at some point, I got up and I said, you know, you are a bunch of bozos, and at the very least, think about the fact that your average woman is going to weigh less than your average man, and so the payload is going to be lower if you just had an all-women crew. And I mean, I think at that point I walked out or something. It was unbelievable, but that's where it was at in those kind of fields back in that day. Yeah, it really, I mean, I look back and I think, oh my God, this really went on.
Yeah. So, you were telling me about getting involved with the union.
Yes.
And what was your first impression of the union?
Well, I had a couple of different first impressions. I mean, one of the things that was really positive, I think, was the fact that, like, both Ellen and Vivian actively, like, sought my participation. And I don't see that happening as much with organizations these days. That, you know, I was kind of a meek person. I wouldn't have put myself forward. I mean, sort of culturally, it was the whole Swedish culture thing is don't speak unless you're spoken to kind of thing, and so then nobody ever says anything, you know. And so the fact that they, you know, asked me to participate in these things and felt like I could actually make a contribution was really important, and it gave me the confidence to be able to do things. So that was one thing. I mean, the other thing I remember thinking was, gee, these are these older women, you know, they're so much more experienced than I am, and now, I mean, I think Vivian is in fact younger than me, and Heather Booth is a year older than me, who I thought was, geez, you know, has to be way more experienced and older than I am. But they had both this commitment to this vision that was feminist but incorporated these other issues that I was concerned about, like the anti-war movement and anti-racism, things like that. The other thing, one of the first things I remember going to was a citywide meeting, because the Women's Union was organized in small groups. There were work groups and chapters, and they had a citywide meeting that basically everybody could come to. And the big discussion at this meeting I went to was about the Camp Duncan conference, which was going to be the second conference of the Women's Union that was in the spring of '71. And the question was who could go to it. And Heather and Vivian were very into limiting who could go to it. And my initial reaction was, that's undemocratic, you know, everybody should be able to go. And part of, you know, after this meeting, I talked to some people and learned a little bit about what the basis of this was, and it turned out that this was the first of a number of episodes of some ultra-leftists trying to come in and basically take over the Women's Union. In this case, it was the Socialist Workers' Party, and they basically didn't want the Socialist Workers' Party to be able to control anything. And ultimately, I think looking back, they were right, although given this sort of very sort of all participatory scenario that we were in the Women's Union, it was pretty hard to, in a sense, justify that. But one of the things that sort of racked the Women's Union existence over its whole lifetime was all the various ultra-left groups that tried to come in and be the correct line for the women's movement. So then I went to the Camp Duncan conference, and I got involved in Liberation School, and we planned some courses on different things.
Where was the Camp Douglas School?
Camp Duncan conference. Camp Duncan, I think, was a YWCA campground somewhere outside of Chicago, and if you asked me to find it now, I couldn't by any means.
Yeah.
But it was, we probably brought sleeping bags, and I think they had cabins that we slept in and stuff, but it was all, I don't know, maybe there were 50, maybe there were 100 women there, I don't remember. One of the people that I met there, although she doesn't remember this, is Judy Syatt, who was at this conference the last couple of days. And at that conference, I remember there was a panel. I think Margaret Schmidt was on it. Somebody from the International Socialist was on it. I think I might have been on it, and maybe one other person, talking about sort of who should be involved in the women's union and what the strategy should be for the women's union, things like that. And I think somewhere around there and at the Palatine Conference they passed a statement of political principles, which is one of the documents I've been hunting for. It's like a one-page thing that was then, I think, at Camp Duncan amended at Camp Duncan, if I remember correctly, it was amended to include support for gay and lesbian liberation. And then, boy, it's so vague in my mind. I mean, there was, I think, at that point, a sense that people didn't want these folks who were in groups like SWP and IS to come in and try and just push their line, that there needed to be sort of an independent socialist feminist perspective. And actually, at some point along in there, I think maybe before Camp Duncan, Heather and the group she was in Hyde Park wrote this paper, Socialist Feminism, A Strategy for the Women's Movement, which she actually repeated the key points of at the conference yesterday, almost verbatim.
Almost verbatim.
Yeah.
The groups from the left that were trying to infiltrate, were they women?
Yes. Now, the groups themselves were mixed, but the people that they sent in were women, yes. Yes. And the Women's Union was always women-only membership. And that was actually one small difference with now, was now always had potentially male members, although most of their members were women. So that was, I don't know, as I say, a lot of this is a little vague in my mind, but I mean, we basically adopted the Socialist Feminist paper and the political principles, and the Women's Union had a variety of different work groups. Liberation School was the one I was most involved in at that point, but there was the Action Committee for Decent Child Care, the Health Care, and Jane, and Direct Action for Rights and Employment, and a bunch of others that sprang up. And then there were chapters. The chapter that I was in was called the M Appeal chapter. And those were sort of like CR groups, consciousness raising. And we called ourselves M Appeal because there was this TV show, The Avengers, where the Avengers were John Steed and Emma Peel, and she could do everything he did. She was tough, and it was a great show.
So tell me about the school, the Liberation School.
Well, the idea for the school, it was pretty much, as far as I know, Vivian's idea, was to do a couple of different things. One was to be a place where women could get skills they would need to deal with the world on their own. And it would be things like auto mechanics. Robin Kaufman and I were talking about this, doing some of these auto mechanics things. So that was one thing. Then there was classes that were I don't know, maybe you could say more politically oriented, like it would be stuff around our bodies ourselves, or political strategy kind of things. And then there were ones that were a little more, I mean, today we would probably call them book groups, where you would read things and have discussions. And, I mean, all tied into the women's movement and feminism, but a little more analytical maybe than activist oriented. So a combination of those things. And the idea was to try and go out and just get women to get involved in these classes and talk to them about feminism and get them involved in activism. Mm-hmm. And there were some groups that sort of sprang out of that. There was a group called Secret Storm. I don't know if it was really directly related to Liberation School, but they went out and organized in the city parks around women being able to have access to city park facilities for women's softball and stuff like that. And they were focused on organizing in some of the more working class neighborhoods in Northwest Chicago. And then there was a speakers bureau that I got involved in, where this was one of these things where the Women's Union would get requests for speakers on various topics. And they would often get requests for the same speakers, like Heather or Vivian. And people wanted to give other folks more of a opportunity to develop their confidence, be able to do public speaking and stuff like that. So what they would do is have somebody who is more experienced go out with somebody who is less experienced, and sort of, it was like a learning curve where, you know, you'd sit in and then you get a chance to do it on your own, and you do practice and stuff like that. So I went out and did some of those. And then we had Blazing Star, which was sprung off of this Women's Liberation as a Lesbian plot course that was organizing.
Tell me about that. What was that?
The course?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this was one of these sort of more analytical courses where, I mean, one of the big things from, I don't know, the media, the press in particular, was this idea that feminists were all a bunch of lesbians and therefore didn't need to be taken seriously. And the reaction of some in the women's movement was, let's, like, you know, just say that's not true, and that's, you know, some of it was fairly anti-gay, and some of it was just, let's not deal with this kind of thing. And so this course was sort of an effort to try and take that line and say, wait a minute, you know, maybe it is almost, you know, that
And the name of the course was?
Women's Liberation is a Lesbian plot. And so we read The Well of Loneliness. I mean, there was not a lot out there at that point. This is 1971. So even Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon's book, The Lesbian Woman, hadn't been published. So there was Radcliffe Hall, there was Juna Barnes, Anais Nin. Those are the ones I remember. I mean, the psychology books of the day were horrendous. You know, the whole homosexuality is a disease. And one of my vivid memories of this course, the courses were usually like 6 to 8 weeks long, and they would meet once a week and have readings, and then in this case, and discussion. And one of the sessions, sort of partway through, a woman named Renee Hanover came. And Renee seemed just unbelievably old at that point, because, you know, here we were, how old was I, 25, and she was maybe 45. But she had been around the gay community, and so she came in, and she was also a fairly acerbic personality, and she basically said, you know, you're all just a bunch of nouveau gays, and you aren't really lesbians, and blah, blah, blah. And I mean, it was just a little like, oh my God, what are we getting into here? But it was, I mean, it was a little more down to earth than, you know, reading Juna Barnes, you know. And so...
What did she expect you to be?
Well, I mean, there was there were all of these strains. I mean, at that point, Rennie was a lawyer, and as far as I know, had been out for probably 20 years or longer, I'm not sure, but was involved in the gay community. I mean, at that point, the people who were sort of in the, what you might think of as traditional gay community, the women mostly didn't call themselves lesbians because it was kind of a clinical, viewed as a clinical term then. So they were gay women, and then there were gay men. And there was a whole social scene. There was a group that was basically focused around the bars and stuff like that. And then as the women's movement developed, there were various lesbian feminist organizations. There was a newspaper in Chicago called Lavender Woman. There was a lesbian feminist center, and there was Chicago Lesbian Liberation, all various strains of sort of radical feminism. And so there was sort of now, there was sort of the mainstream feminists, and then there was CWLU, which was the socialist feminists, and then there were these various radical feminists who thought now was too mainstream, too focused on legislative and legal victories. These were more the personalist political people, and they were different from the women's union in the sense of not having as much connection to some of the other issues that, their key focus was on lesbian-related issues rather than a sort of broader range of women's issues. And so, and then sort of overlaid on this was this layer of women who had been out for, a few years, who mainly didn't have any connection to the women's movement. They were gay, and that was where they were at. This was also 2 years after Stonewall, so in a sense, I think Rennie was connected more into the gay movement there, because there were women like Barbara Giddings in Philadelphia and Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon who really were more tied in with the gay movement than the women's movement. So there were all of these dynamics going on, and I think Rennie saw some of us as I've lost the word now that I'm trying to think of, like
Dilettante?
Dilettantes, yes. That's probably a good word. That, wannabes. We weren't really lesbians because this was just, this was the women's movement. It was sort of like you were just trying it out and stuff. I mean, eventually I worked with Rennie on a number of different campaigns, and I think she decided that at least I and a couple of the other women were in fact real lesbians, that we'd pass the test of time or something. And she was still pretty acerbic, but she had been out there more than we had earlier on, and there was so after this course, a bunch of us started getting together, and partly what we started to do was, at that point, check out some of the other lesbian feminist organizations and see if we couldn't make connections to the women's union. And so I remember going to Chicago Lesbian Liberation meetings back then, and they would be once a week. There would be 100 women there every week, and it would be different 100 women every week. There were maybe 5 women that were there time after time. And they really didn't like the women's union because not only, we weren't just a lesbian organization, but we were sort of willing to deal with men. They really didn't like now because they had men in there. But we didn't have men in the women's union, but we had women who were straight who dealt with men, and that was enough. So that made us not really lesbians in their eyes. It was, the dynamics were just kind of bizarre in that day and age, I think. And there was one incident where there was a bar over on Halstead and Grace that was called Augie's at that point. It was originally the In-Between Club, and then it became Augie's. And the owner was a woman named Olga, and her girlfriend Donna. And Olga had a son who was in his 20s, I guess. And he would come into the bar, and he would get into fights with some of the women. And some of the lesbian feminist center women got ticked off and, you know, were going to do something like boycott the bar. I don't remember exactly, but they then called a meeting with the owners to try and deal with this. Basically, they wanted to bar him from the bar. And Donna came, and I would guess she was maybe 10 years older than me, in her 30s, but sort of working class lesbian. And at one point in this meeting, I remember her saying, you know, we revolted in our way. I mean, and she was in the kind of mode of very butch, leather jacket, motorcycle boots kind of thing, that was their way of revolting, and we had our way of revolting, and she thought our way was better, that it was going to change things. And I thought, this is kind of amazing. Now, you know, it didn't do much to heal over the rift that was going on, but it made me think, well, you know, we should be talking to these people, you know. There's not this big gulf that it seems like there was. So then in Blazing Star, we used some of the tactics from the outreach group that was working with women in the city parks, and wrote up a little newsletter called Blazing Star.
And that was a lesbian newspaper?
Yes, that was a lesbian newspaper. And we'd take it around to the bars. We went out to the Lost and Found, which was over here, like Fullerton in California, Irving in California, that's right. And Sue and Nan's, and Augie's and His and Hers, and all of these places, and, you know, talk to the folks there and hang out and play pool. There's another place that opened up over, like, I don't know, Racine and Diversey, or Racine and Fullerton, or someplace down there. But anyways, we even went down a few times to the Patch down in Cal City, which was a whole different world down there. That was actually, I remember going down there when I was in my 30s, and they carded me, and I was like, come on, I'm 34, you gotta give me a break here, people. But, so that was sort of the genesis of that kind of effort to organize.
Mm-hmm. And at what point, at that point, you thought of yourself as a lesbian?
Yes.
And do you know at what point you did that became your identity?
Yes, well, sort of. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember when I was 12 thinking, I mean, as I say, very naive Midwestern girl. My mother tried really hard to give us some kind of sex education, but she didn't like to talk about it, and so we really didn't. And so at 12, I remember thinking, well, it looks like women can either be wives and mothers or old maid school teachers. So I'm going to be an old maid school teacher, because I'm definitely not going to be a wife and mother. That was not it. And then when I was in college, when I was about 19, I remember walking across the campus, and it was like one of those cartoons where the light bulb goes on. It's like, I'm a lesbian. And it was, I don't know what sort of started me thinking that, but that was like, okay, so now what do I do? You know, I'm up in Northfield, Minnesota with no clue. And so my first thought was, you know, I'll go and find some books. You know, what else do you do? And so I went to the library, and as I recall, the books were all on the locked shelves, so you had to request them. And so I thought, I'm not requesting these books, forget that, you know, and everybody will know. And so I didn't do anything for several years, and then I got to this Women's Liberation as a Lesbian plot, and that was sort of like a way to come out. Mm-hmm. I do remember at some point in there, and I don't know, again, the chronology is a little fuzzy, but walking back and forth in front of the In-Between on Halstead thinking, I really should go in there, but not being able to. And I remember years later meeting this woman who was probably 60 at that point, and I was in my 30s, and she said when she had been 20-something, she had gotten herself to go into a gay bar and was so freaked out by it that she basically went back in the closet for 40 years. And that was it. And so, I mean, in that sense, that could have been me, but I was lucky enough to find the women's movement.
So you were involved with Chicago Women's Liberation Union and these various organizations, and then what happened?
Well, in, I guess, 72, I was on the staff of the Women's Union. I was on the steering committee, and I think at some point I was on the planning committee. And one of the things we did was we planned the Socialist Feminist Conference. We were among the people who planned the Socialist Feminist Conference in Yellow Springs, Ohio, which brought together women from the various women's union, because the women's union model here was used as a model for women's union in the Twin Cities and Berkeley and various other places. So the idea, I think, was maybe we needed to have a national organization, and so it unfortunately didn't turn out that way, but we had this conference in Yellow Springs, Ohio in, I think, 75, and there were 3,000 people there. It was huge. And I spoke on a panel that included, amongst other people, Charlotte Bunch on lesbianism and socialist feminism. It was a socialist feminist-oriented conference. And then there had been, over the years, a series of different groups, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Party Marxist-Leninists, all of these ultra-left groups coming around. And at this Yellow Springs conference, there was a group that I cannot remember the name of. It was Workers something. Workers' Party Marxist-Leninist, or God only knows. But they had one group that was the Asian women's group that wanted to join the women's union as a group that it turned out were actually members of this ultra-left group. And then they recruited a couple of women who were in the women's union to form another group that supported them. And over the next 2 years, basically there was a series of fairly horrible fights about the direction of the women's union. And there was a meeting in 77 where somebody from the Asian women's group spoke, either Beth Blackson or Vicki Cooper from their supporters group, which I don't remember the name of, spoke. Jenny Knaus spoke from, I forget what their group was, but she was involved in healthcare a lot. I spoke. Mickey Leaner from the Women's Prison Project spoke. There might have been somebody else. Estelle might have spoken from the Graphics Collective. And it was just very frightening, frankly. I remember before this meeting, Beth Blackson came to my house over here on Palmer at 11 o'clock at night and basically threatened me and said I was not a good supporter of the working class, that my line was wrong, and blah, blah, blah. And I finally just shut the door. But, you looked at that room, it was 100 people there. Probably 90% of the people supported either our position or Jenny Knaus or one of the other groups, and a handful supported the Asian women's group and Vicki and Beth, and it basically destroyed the women's union. It was just, people just, for whatever reason, couldn't go on. It was like it sucked the life out of the organization. And so our group, Blazing Star, we decided we wanted to stick together and keep doing organizing, and we talked about how we wanted to do this, and we thought our options were to either hook up with NOW or hook up with the New American Movement, which is a socialist feminist organization that was mixed, men and women. And we went back and forth and finally decided to work with NAM rather than NOW. You know, and who knows which would have been the better choice, you know. Hindsight is always 20/20, as they say. But we did that, and then in the process of that, we actually, some of us continued the organizing, but also got involved in some coalitions. So one of the things that started happening about that period of time was Anita Bryant and her anti-gay crusade, and so folks in Chicago decided to form the Gay and Lesbian Coalition of Metropolitan Chicago. It was basically a coalition of essentially any group in the gay and lesbian community that wanted to be involved. So NOW had a representative. We did. The Illinois Gay and Lesbian Task Force did. The Gold Coast Bar did, that Chuck Renslow owned. It was a big leather bar. Yeah. His and Hers that Marge Summit owned was there. Jim Flint, a lot of the meetings were held at the Baton Lounge, that was his drag bar. But it was this huge coalition to basically fight Anita Bryant. And, you know, we had marches, we got buttons with oranges with a slash through them and stuff like that. And then I got involved in the Illinois Gay and Lesbian Task Force and became co-chair of that. And then Mary Jean Collins called me up in 1982 and asked me to come to Washington to work for NOW on lesbian rights. And I did. So that's
And so you moved to Washington?
Moved to Washington.
To work for her?
To work for, well,
for
she
NOW?
was, yes. She was the vice president for Action, and so all of the programmatic stuff was under her. And so she had staff for different programmatic things, and she wanted to set up basically a lesbian rights program and asked me to head it up.
Interesting. And she was living in Washington?
Yes. She was elected in '82 and moved to Washington maybe in the end of '82, I'm not sure. And then I moved there in February of '83. And
well, let's go back. I certainly want to hear about that, but let's go back to after the union kind of fell apart, and then you worked for the Illinois Coalition. Was that it?
Well,
was a co-chair of that. Did you?
Well,
say?
yes. It was the Gay and Lesbian Coalition of Metropolitan Chicago. That was one group.
Okay.
And that was the coalition, and Guy Warner and I were co-chairs of that.
So they had a man and a woman.
Well, right.
Yeah.
And that was pretty ad hoc. We would meet once a week, once every other week, and basically, as I remember, a lot of the focus at that point in the late 70s was Anita Bryant and her various campaigns and efforts to stop that and to try and build this sort of community in Chicago. And then one of the groups that was involved in it was the Illinois Gay and Lesbian Task Force, which was pushing for gay rights legislation at the state level. And Bill Kelly was one of the leaders in that. And Bill Reaney was involved in that. Al Wardell was involved. Mark Zubro, who now writes gay mystery stories, was involved. John Ballister, who is, I think, the president of one of the colleges downtown, was co-chair with me at one point. So the coalition was this sort of broad effort to bring different groups together, and then the task force was oriented towards legislation at the city and the state level.
At the city and state. Okay.
Yeah. So I remember John and I met with Richie Daley when he was state's attorney, and
what did you meet with him about?
about getting his support for a gay rights bill in Chicago.
Okay, so you were involved with that effort, the gay rights?
Yeah.
So tell me something about that.
Boy, if only I remembered more. I remember in the late 70s, I think in the gay movement nationally, there was an effort to get gay rights legislation passed. And the first state that passed it was Wisconsin, as David Clarenbach mentioned yesterday in '81. But there was a lot of efforts at the local level to pass things. And so we wanted to get something passed in the city council. Now, Cliff Kelly was the chief sponsor. And Cliff was African-American alderman somewhere in the South Side. I don't remember exactly where. But he would put this bill in. And, you know, we would meet with him. We would meet with Richie Daley, who was the state's attorney at the time, to get his support. Julie Hamos, who worked for Richie, was very supportive, as I recall. And we would try and do things like, you know, we'd go out and circulate petitions down in Wicker Park and various other places up in the, you know, Old Town, New Town area where there was a big gay community, but we also tried to branch out and do it like down around here and other places, and had some success. I forget exactly when anything passed. I mean, it probably passed after I left Chicago, to be honest. But it was the kind of thing that was starting to build a little bit, that there was beginning to be somewhat broader support for that kind of thing. And we would also, I mentioned the Speakers Bureau from the Women's Union. I remember also we would have Speakers Bureau maybe from the Coalition or the Task Force, where we would go to high schools when the teachers wanted somebody to come and talk about what it was like to be gay. I remember one time going down to the Chicago Police Academy to talk to them about, you know, you don't just beat up gay people, this is who we are, kind of thing. Stuff like that, that would have been in the late 70s, early 80s. And so that was the kind of activities that we were involved in. And when it was the task force and the coalition stuff, was usually an effort to have a man and a woman go. Mm-hmm. Now, there were always fewer women in these organizations. But
what did you feel that was an issue in the organizations, that they were not aware of women's issues?
Well, yes, in some instances I think it was definitely an issue that they were not aware. I remember after it must have been a coalition meeting, there was the various religious groups, Dignity and so on, had representatives, and one of them was somebody from Integrity, which is the Gay Episcopalians, and we were having this discussion, and they said their main focus was, we want to, you know, have the Episcopal Church ordain gay priests. But he then said, you know, the church didn't allow women to be ordained at that point, and that was okay. That went with church teaching, and they didn't see any connection, you know, that, you know, somehow the fact that the churches wouldn't ordain women and wouldn't ordain gays were somehow linked didn't even occur to some of them. But at the same time, there was, and the fact that people said, well, we do need a male and a female in these positions, meant that there was at least some knowledge. And so I think some of them were sort of much more receptive to, if not the whole idea of feminism, at least the idea that women's rights was somehow connected with the struggle for gay and lesbian rights. Mm-hmm. But there was definitely some resistance. And it was sort of, in some ways, culture shock, I think, for many of us initially to be in these coalitions with, Chuck Renslow from the leather clubs and the men's bathhouses, and Jim Flint from the drag bars, but it also ultimately, I think, broadened our cultural views, of what was legitimate culturally and socially. Certainly broadened my views over what I was raised with.
Right. Right. When you were involved with these organizations, did you have a daytime job?
Yes, I had several of them. I taught science at Roosevelt University part-time for a couple of years, I think. I taught science and math in Beis Yaakov Hebrew Parochial School up on the north side for a year, 7th and 8th grade. Not what I was cut out for at all. I mean, this was an Orthodox Jewish school, and they needed a woman to teach the girls science and math, and I was like their last ditch before the school year started. And it was an interesting experience, but definitely junior high was not the age group for me. And then I got a job in '74 as a research assistant at the University of Illinois School of Public Health in environmental health, because they wanted somebody who knew physics and computers. So I worked on studies on mathematical modeling of smoking and carcinogenesis and radiation carcinogenesis and stuff like that for 8 years.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and then our funding ran out in '82 after Reagan was in there a couple of years. So that's when I was hunting for a job, and Mary Jean offered me the job in D.C. And so.
So you moved. So tell me about that. When you moved to D.C., what did you do for her?
Well, we now at that point had a policy of supporting lesbian rights. And I did some sort of coalition stuff in Washington that was along the lines of lobbying. I never did heavy-duty lobbying, but I did more like, I guess you could call it legislative research to see what was going on in the Hill in terms of legislation related to lesbian rights. And we also worked with the state now organizations. And one of the things that we tried to do was to do some pilot projects. I mean, now is a relatively big organization, but it still didn't have unlimited resources. And at that point, it certainly looked as if the venue for lesbian and gay rights legislation was at the state level, because the Wisconsin law passed in '81, and Massachusetts passed at some point after that. I forget exactly when. And so I did some research in terms of what states might be appropriate, where now could play a role in helping to pass gay rights legislation. And we set up a program in New Jersey. That's the one I remember. There were a couple of other states where we did some stuff. And I would also go out and do some organizing in different states. And then probably a lot of what I wound up doing was preparing stuff for Mary Jean, because she was sort of the elected leader who was working on this stuff. And the various state nows, as I recall, would have her come and speak, and she would be the one that would really represent now at coalitions, things like that. So it was sort of both of us were interested in setting up something that had some grassroots organizing element to it. And so that was the aim of getting a few states that were pilot states where that we could build on to pass gay rights legislation, and then being in coalitions at the national level to support gay rights. Up until, '82 was the end of the ERA campaign. So in a sense, there was also a little bit of a vacuum at now in terms of where to go with stuff. And she had somebody, I can't remember people's names at all at this point, who was working for her on sort of economic related issues. And there were a couple of other people, so she had a staff of 3 or 4 working on different things. So that, and then around that time was when AIDS started sort of getting a little more visibility. We also, the other thing I remember was in '84 was the Democratic Convention in San Francisco. So we went out there and I sort of represented NOW in the various gay meetings that were held there. There were relatively few gay delegates to the Democratic Convention, but we participated in the little, hospitality suites, I guess they were called, stuff like that. And then in '85 was the election where Judy Goldsmith and Mary Jean were defeated, and so then I was on to other things.
And what happened in that election?
Well, Ellie Smeel had been president before Judy Goldsmith and was term limited, and Judy had been
President
of NOW. Yes, and Judy had been her vice president, and so Judy Goldsmith was the person who was sort of the natural successor, and she picked basically a slate to run with her, and they were elected. And then I think Ellie felt that she would actually be running things behind the scenes, and I don't think
they were actually elected then?
Yeah.
Judy Goldsmith was elected president?
Yes,
Okay.
in '82.
All right. And Mary Jean was
elected vice president for Action, yes.
Okay.
And Kathy Webb was secretary, Barb Timmer was vice president. There were 2 vice presidents. She's the executive, and Alice Chapman was the treasurer. And somewhere along the line, there was a falling out between Judy and Ellie, and Ellie's people, and Judy and Mary Jean. And Ellie ran again for president in '85 and defeated Judy, and her slate won. And it was a pretty much knockdown, drag out kind of fight. And so at that point, the whole staff changed over.
And was Judy Goldsmith located in Wisconsin, or was she in Washington?
Well, at that point, she was in Washington. She and Mary Jean both moved to Washington. So did Kathy Webb, who was from Arkansas, I think. Alice Chapman was already treasurer, and so she was in Washington. I'm not sure about Barb Timmer. Don't remember where she was from.
Okay. Well, I know a little bit about this, but not too much. So.
Yeah. Yes, the NOW internal politics could get pretty fierce.
And what was it about, do you think?
I think it was mainly about who controlled the organization. I don't know that there were huge issues. There might have been some issues where Judy wanted to diversify NOW's agenda a little bit more than Ellie did. Ellie wanted to, I think, go back and do the ERA over again. So, and Mary Jean and Judy and that contingent, I think, were in some ways sort of the left of NOW. The Chicago NOW chapter was more activist, and the leadership was more left-oriented than some of the rest of NOW was. But
left in what way?
Well, left in having a sort of more broadly progressive political perspective that was less single-issue focused. Also more organizing oriented. There is this long tradition in Chicago of organizing, going back to Saul Alinsky and then the Midwest Academy, and that was one of the real hallmarks of the Women's Union, and I think in a different way of Chicago NOW, that it wasn't as it wasn't just running your mouth the way some of the left was in other parts of the country, that there was this real idea that, you know, if you were going to make change, you had to actually organize in some way. So I'm trying to be not as harsh as I might be about some of these comments.
Okay. Well, I think you're doing a good job.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Well, so then you were in Washington, and then Mary Jean and so on was defeated, and then what happened to you?
Well, then one of the groups that we had worked with was the National Association of Gay and Lesbian Democratic Clubs, and also the Gertrude Stein Democratic Club, which was the local gay Democratic club. And in 85, Tom Charlton was the head of the National Association, and he wanted to plan a conference of openly gay and lesbian elected officials, of whom at that point there were actually enough to have a conference. And so he asked me to help work on it. So I got a sort of very part-timey job working on the West Hollywood Conference, which was the first conference of openly gay and lesbian elected officials. And I don't know who all was there. I mean, mostly at that point it was local elected officials, but Barney Frank was there. Pretty sure Tammy Baldwin was there. Since it was in California, a number of the California folks were there. And Chris Smith, who was later Minister of Culture in the Labour government in England, came over as a guest speaker from the British House of Commons. And I think Sven Robinson, who was in the Canadian Parliament, was there. So it was mostly American, but there were a few international guests. And so I worked on that. And then at the same time, I had gotten involved in local DC stuff, because that was sort of where I was coming from, was local politics, and I wanted to, you know, be able to keep a hand in. It's very easy in Washington to get caught up in all this, you know, high-level, important, so to speak, stuff. And so I had gotten involved in the Stein Club, and Bill Bogan was the president and asked me to run for president to succeed him. And I did, and I won, and so then I was president of Stein for 3 years. Now
Was that the Gertrude Stein?
The Gertrude Stein Democratic Club, yes.
Okay, and what was that?
That was a local gay and lesbian democratic club that worked in D.C. for various gay and lesbian rights. Now, the D.C. City Council is both, and has a history of being much more progressive than many other city councils. And the mayor at the time, Marion Barry, had forged an alliance with Richard Malsby, who was the first president of Stein, to get his support in his first run for mayor back in the 70s. And so there was this sort of coalition between the mayor and his people and the Stein Club. And so there were a number of gay rights laws passed by the city council, and openly gay appointees in Washington. Now the downside was DC is basically still a colony, and so everything in DC had to be approved by Congress.
Oh, that's right.
Which is not nearly so friendly, so that some of the stuff was overturned, but ultimately various gay rights laws were passed there, and the Stein Club was fairly instrumental in that. And then in the mid-'80s, when I was president, the issue that was coming up was AIDS. And so I remember testifying before the city council with Jim Graham, who was then president of the Whitman Walker Clinic, about the city needing to provide more funding for AIDS care. Jim is now a member of the city council and was one of the first openly gay members there. And so I was president of Stein for 3 years, from 85 to about 88, I guess. And actually, my one claim to fame there is that I really didn't want to run for a third term, and there were only, Richard Maltby had been president 3 times, and a couple other people twice, but nobody else, I couldn't strong-arm anybody else into it. So in the last time, Frank Kameny nominated me for president for my 3rd term, and I was elected unanimously because nobody else would do it. But through that, I did get to know Frank a little bit. And Frank, of course, is one of the, I don't know, icons of the gay movement going back to the 50s and so on. So that was, in many ways, very exciting to have had that opportunity to work with him. So the other thing I should say is that right before I moved to Washington, I had had a couple of relationships when I was in Chicago. I broke up with someone shortly before I moved, and then I met Judy Nedrow, who worked for Mary Jean at Chicago now, and we got involved right before I moved out to D.C. And so then for about 6 or 9 months, we would go back and forth, and then she moved to Washington in December of '83. And so we've been living together ever since. So next year is our 30th anniversary. So, thank you.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
So, that's, and then, after Stein, I had a variety of different movement jobs and organizational jobs, and eventually decided that I needed a job where I actually got paid a salary, since I was at that, charged up my expenses for these various jobs to my credit cards, and they needed paying off. Yeah. And so I started working for SAS, which is statistical analysis software. So I've been there for 13 years and just doing little volunteer work here and there. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, that's good. It's always good to get a salary coming in.
Yes.
On a regular basis.
Yes, it definitely is a good idea.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
Well, this is wonderful. I've learned so much from talking to you. It's really great.
Good.
Anything else you want to talk about, more specifically about Chicago, looking back on that experience?
Well, about 10 years ago, I guess, I was invited to a conference at the University of Chicago. It was, I forget the theme, but they wanted me to talk about something like lessons from the women's movement. And somewhere I have a copy of the paper I wrote, which I can send to you, because I couldn't repeat the whole thing right now. But I remember as I wrote that paper that there were a number of things that were both very important for me personally, being involved in the women's movement, and also that I think are important politically looking back. Mm-hmm. Part of it was that being in the women's union, we did have this perspective. I mean, I don't remember the whole political principles, but I remember the first couple of lines were, women's liberation is essential to the liberation of all oppressed people. Women's liberation will not be achieved until all people were free. And that we understood there was an interconnection between these various struggles that were going on and are still going on. So that was one thing. The second thing that we learned was the idea that it wasn't just about coming up with, the best set of political principles, that what really was important was putting them into action and to actually trying to change something. And I was, up until I got into the Women's Union, in pretty much of an academic. I mean, I sort of saw an academic career for myself, some professor somewhere. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, but there are some limitations to that. If it's sort of like there are times at which I think academia becomes counting how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and that's not all there is to thinking about these issues or working on these issues, that you have to combine that with some kind of action if in fact anything is going to change. And so those were things that, really changed my life. both, I mean, really changed it because I didn't become an academic. I spent, you know, some years in academia, but at the time also spent, you know, 30 years pretty much as an activist, that really was sort of the core element of my life, and something that I think did ultimately make a difference. And I guess in some ways that's all you can hope for from life, is to be able to change things for the better.
Mm-hmm.
So.
That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. So, anything else I can tell you?
Well, I don't think so at this point.
Okay.
I think it was just terrific.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad it was helpful.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure.